Have you ever heard of Generation Alpha?
This new generation might just be brain dead.
We are in a crisis.
This next generation might just be doomed.
We truly are in the end times of humanity.
I don't think we understand how bad it's actually going to get.
The next generation is caught.
Chances are, you've probably seen a recent influx of videos and articles on Gen Alpha decrying the latest generation as doomed, hopeless, or some other phrase describing how they're uniquely worse than previous generations. But is this really true? Is Gen Alpha actually the worst generation? Let's examine why the subject of Gen Alpha is trending in the first place. Part of it has to do with the simple fact that Gen Z is currently being replaced by Gen A as the latest rising generation, slowly developing their own identity and culture, explained in my previous video. Another big reason why it's trendy to panic over Gen Alpha is because of some serious concerns that must be acknowledged. Most notably, the alarming number of screens children today have access to, the pandemic and its effects on Gen Alpha's performance in school, and the unprecedented era of children growing up in a world with VR and AI. Despite all these very real issues, no one is talking about the biggest reason for this trend of Gen Alpha doomerism: society's timeless fear and panic over the youth. Today, it's Generation Alpha and their inability to read, obsession over skibbity toilet, and lack of basic manners. But people seem to forget that just yesterday, it was Generation Z and our lack of basic manners, obsession over MLG brain rot, and non-existent attention span. And millennials, don't think we forgot about you either. You were the subject of abuse by boomers for years, with the infamous 2013 Time article summarizing Gen Y as lazy, entitled narcissists, as well as getting blamed for the death of everything from golf to credit cards. Now you might think it stops with the millennials, and that prior to their existence, all the generations lived in peaceful harmony. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Generation X was known as the lost generation, being scolded for their lack of work ethic, disinterest in marriage, and short attention span. Now, to the 1% of my audience who are boomers watching this, you might be laughing at the rest of us right now. But just because your elders are no longer on this earth to expose you, doesn't mean that I won't. This may come as a surprise because boomers have often hidden this fact from anyone younger than them, but the generations who fought in World War I, survived the Spanish flu, lived through the Great Depression, and fought in World War II, accuse baby boomers of being the spoiled, immoral, narcissistic generation that plagues society. Now, I don't know if it was generational trauma or just projection, but almost every modern label we associate with the younger generations, whether that be for Gen Alpha, Gen Z, Millennials, or Gen X, were all originally used for boomers. But it doesn't even stop with them. Pretty much every generation prior to boomers have had older people bemoaning them for many of the same critiques we hear for the youth today. It's a phenomenon that occurs when humans reach a certain age that I'd like to call the kids these days effect. Kids these days are obsessed with luxury, have bad manners, contempt for authority, show disrespect for their elders, and prefer chatting over going outside. Children don't respect their parents and tyrannize their teachers at school. You might assume this was written by a disgruntled elder ranting about how Gen Alpha is ruining society as we know it. But this wasn't written with Gen Alpha in mind. No, it wasn't for Gen Z either. In fact, it wasn't for millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, or any generation you can think of. This was from Aristotle, with me simply adjusting the passage to the way we speak today, but nonetheless from someone who lived over 2,000 years ago, complaining about the newer generation born after his. So why does this happen? Why do older generations insist on using the same stereotypes for youth that were used against themselves when they were young? There seems to be two major reasons for this way of thinking. The first being that much like how nostalgia is rose-tinted, people seem to conveniently forget the many critiques and issues their generation faced when they were younger, and inadvertently push these same critiques onto the next generation. The second reason is people tend to feel that their generation was special in some way. When researching this subject, I would often look into videos of every generation in their era of youth. and see endless comments by said generations lamenting about how much the world has changed since they were young. But more interestingly, almost without fail, they would make a statement that was something along the lines of, "We had it so good back then." The younger generations don't know what it's like to live without. For generations prior to boomers, it was TV. For baby boomers who grew up with TVs, it was computers. For Gen X who first saw computers, it was social media. For millennials with MySpace and AOL, it was smartphones. For Gen Z with their iPhones, it's now AI. And undoubtedly, for Gen Alpha in the future with their ChatGPT 15 and Vision Pro 6, it will probably be something like brain chips. This phenomenon seen across every generation is only logical. In a world that is so rapidly changing and full of new technologies that have positive utility, but also plenty of negative effects as well, it's easy for older people to point to a specific thing that ruined today's children, or at the very least, made childhoods today so much less enjoyable than previous ones. Everyone has a bias in seeing themselves as part of the last true generation, before it all went bad. But what's really true is, there is no last generation. As long as humans continue to create new technologies and new humans, there will always be a revolutionary technology or product that changes how children grow up compared to kids in the past. For millennials and Gen Z, the internet was our revolutionary technology, allowing us to have access to a free and open space to connect with others, learn more about the world, and just have fun. However, without a VPN, our personal information is exposed to internet service providers, tech companies, advertisers, and even data brokers, and we risk having our private data collected by the government or stolen by hackers without our consent. So I'm proud to say that I was already a paying user with ExpressVPN way before this sponsorship, because they're consistently rated by third-party organizations for being the #1 VPN to use when it comes to protecting our data and privacy on the internet. By using ExpressVPN, you can utilize their best-in-class encryption technologies to protect your personal information, switch your internet's location to anywhere in the world to bypass restrictions on what you can see, and do so much more. And with recent legislation being passed threatening to completely ban apps that millions of us use, ExpressVPN is the perfect way to still have access to your favorite blocked content. Whether that be for TV shows like The Office, a personal favorite of mine, movies, or even TikTok. So be sure to go to expressvpn.com/bofang to get 3 months of ExpressVPN for free, so you can have access to a more private, more secure, and more open internet. There are, of course, some very real issues that plague Gen Alpha today. In fact, 3 in particular that are often mentioned by the Gen A doomers. The pandemic and its effects on children's education, Gen Alpha not knowing how to multiply, and the excessive use of devices, creating the term iPad kids. To the first point, the pandemic had a devastating effect on children's learning capabilities when classes were online. But fortunately, for the vast majority of schools, they were shut down for at most a year or 2. So while the effects of lockdown still exist, since we're in the immediate aftermath of it happening, they appear to be waning, and educators believe that over the long term, kids would eventually be able to catch up and regain lost ground. When it comes to Gen Alpha not learning their multiplication tables, it's often helpful to zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture. It was just yesterday when older folks were bemoaning Gen Z for not learning how to write in cursive. And it seems like we're doing the same thing to Gen Alpha for not being taught how to multiply.
You don't think, you never figured out how to think. Too stupid to understand and follow simple rudimentary instructions.
Say you went to college. What would you study, you think?
But frankly, it's a good thing that Gen Z didn't waste time learning how to write in cursive, since almost everything by that point was being digitized and typed, rather than handwritten. And the same can be said for Gen Alpha. Why waste time learning multiplication tables when by this point, everyone and their dog has a phone that can do the math for them? The classic excuse teachers used to force previous generations to memorize them was, you won't always have a calculator in your pocket. But now, that's simply false. So not learning their multiplication tables doesn't make Gen Alpha more stupid. It's just that the skills they should learn today are different from the skills we needed to learn yesterday. It'd be much more useful for kids to be taught, for example, how to write precise prompts for AI engines, rather than memorizing what 8 times 7 is. Lastly, the most talked about issue with Gen Alpha is their excessive use of devices like iPads and smartphones. And I'll admit, this is perhaps the biggest question that doesn't have an easy answer, and videos of these iPad kids feel incredibly dystopian and sad to watch. The only real solution is for parents to set strict limits on the amount of screen time their children can have. And Gen Z? Let's try to take notes from millennials with Gen Alpha kids on what not to do when we raise Generation Beta. That is, of course, if we can ever afford to have children in the first place. But people seem to forget that before iPad parenting was a thing, there was a different screen parents would use to raise their children. The television screen. Before Steve Apple even uttered the word iPad in 2010, millions of children around the world were essentially raised by their TV for decades. Often those from working class families due to parents who were too busy keeping a roof over their heads or too tired after work to spend more time with them. And yet, the vast majority of us seem to be doing just fine, which will probably be the same for most Gen Alpha kids too. In fact, I'm willing to bet that there are plenty of adults who grew up with the first iPads over a decade ago that are able to confirm in the comments how they eventually grew out of their iPad kid phase and aren't freaks to society. Oh yeah, and remember the dystopian video I showed earlier of that kid mindlessly scrolling through his devices? Here's him also playing outside like any normal child. But of course, we know which video got millions of views and which one got ignored. Maybe these kids aren't so doomed after all. With all this generational talk, you might start thinking, does any of it matter? Are generations even real? The answer is yes. They are real, they do matter, and here's why. The best way to understand this is to think about color. Both color and generations exist on a continuum that flows from one to another, and every culture and even every individual may have their own opinion on where each begins and ends. You can also be more precise with both these concepts by creating names for areas that are in between two things we already identify, like blue and green and call it cyan, or zillennial for people who are in between what we identify as Gen Z and millennial. Yet just because we can't all agree on whether to call this blue, or green, or cyan, or teal, no one says that color isn't real. So just like with colors, even if we argue about where exactly each generation starts or ends, that doesn't make the concept of generations any less real. There absolutely are differences between people who grew up in the 60s compared with those who grew up in the 90s. And it's important for us to have meaningful terms for these categories, even if no one can agree on their exact borders. Okay, great, you might say. So generations are real. But tell me, Bofang, which one is the worst? Well, believe it or not, it is indeed Gen Alpha. But it's also Gen Z, and millennials, and Gen X, and boomers, and every generation prior for creating the world that Gen Alpha had to grow up in. You see, any generation that you or I claim to be the worst couldn't have been so without previous generations creating the very environment for them to be the worst to begin with. Gen Alpha can't be the worst generation without their millennial parents giving them iPads to overuse and their boomer grandparents inventing these devices in the first place. Boomers can't be the worst generation without their parents creating abusive households for them to grow up in, after coming home from world wars started by their parents. But the inverse is also just as true. You can always point to past generations that created the conditions for a certain generation to be the very best. For Martin Luther King to lead the civil rights movement through peaceful means, he studied Gandhi's success with nonviolent activism against the British Empire. For the Wright brothers to be the first to fly, Otto Lilienthal pioneered the initial gliders that paved the way for future developments in aviation. For Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay to climb Mount Everest on the 9th expedition, George Mallory led the first 3 expeditions that gave them the knowledge to finally reach its peak. For Neil Armstrong to set foot on the moon, mathematicians like Norbert Wiener needed to build the framework to calculate how to land him there in the first place. Isaac Newton, who inspired Einstein to develop his theory of relativity, and himself inspired by Kepler's laws of planetary motion, is famous for creating his theory of universal gravitation. But few people know him for his wise, yet humble writings, once saying, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." We all stand on these shoulders of giants from the past, which is why the worst generation isn't Gen Alpha. It's every generation. But it's just as much why the best generation is also every generation. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be incredibly grateful if you can like and subscribe for more. Please consider supporting me on Patreon to help me make more videos for you to watch. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons for allowing me to keep a roof over my head.